Okay, so we have our custom use user hook now, and our app component is using it. But the next question is, how can we convert over our existing components to use this custom hook, right? In other words, how can we convert over components like auth route, logout button, unauth route, and some of our pages to use this custom hook that we created so that we can reduce the amount of Firebase code that's scattered throughout our components? Well, the way that we do that, it's actually quite simple. All we have to do really is look at our app component and find all of the components in here that are using this user thing. Okay, so user, 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 user. And basically, we're just going to convert them to use this use user hook. That was a funny sentence. We have to convert them to use this use user hook in order to get the user instead of a prop. So what we're going to do, let's, I suppose, just start off with our navbar here. Let's open up our navbar.js component. And what we're going to do is get rid of this user prop, and instead we're going to import our use user hook by saying import use user from /hooks/use user. And then down here, all we need to do is get the user. Okay, so to do that, we're going to say const, and then in curly braces, because we are, remember, returning an object from our custom hook here that contains both isLoading and user. And then we're just going to say equals use user. And that should really be all we need to do. So if we go back and take a look at our application now, we're just going to refresh it, and we should see that that's automatically being displayed up at the top. Now, looking at this, I do see that there's one little problem that we might want to work around, and that is when we refresh, you can see that the entire application is displayed as loading. Now, this is fine, and it works. It makes sure that none of our components tries to access user before everything is actually loaded, but there's a lot of pieces in our application that really don't need the user, right? In our navbar, for example, this part doesn't need the user, and in fact, the entire container of the navbar could still be displayed while our application is loading, right? It is a little bit funny to just have nothing displayed of our application until we're sure whether the user's logged in or not. So what we're going to do to remedy this, and this is going to influence, by the way, how we end up using the use user hook in our navbar component. What we're going to do is back in our app.js component, we're going to move this isLoading thing down inside our div here. So essentially only the contents of our page, right, whatever page we're on, will be replaced with the loading message and not the entire application, right? The navbar, for example, will still be displayed while our application is loading. So what that's going to look like is essentially we're just going to add curly braces inside of here. We're going to steal this isLoading thing like that and paste it inside of there. And then we're just going to take the switch and everything inside of it and put it inside here as basically the JSX to display if our application, right, if our user is not loading. Okay, otherwise we're going to display the loading message right there. Okay, so in other words, now everything outside of that will be displayed, right? The centered container will still be displayed, the navbar will still be displayed, the router will still be displayed, etc. And, that should just make it a little bit more, a little bit less strange to look at when we refresh our application. Now, one thing that is going to happen if we refresh the page, and you might see it up here, is that for a brief moment, the login and create account buttons flash in our navbar before it actually picks up that there's a user and displays the logout button and the user's email. Now, in this situation, what we'll probably want to do is display a loading message there while it's loading so that you don't get that kind of funny interface going on. So the way that we can do that is inside our navbar, we're going to also get the isLoading property from our use user hook. And we're just going to say if isLoading return. Oops, actually, we want to have that down here. Yeah, instead of all this stuff here, we'll say isLoading question mark. We're going to display the loading message here if that's the case. Otherwise, we're going to check if user exists and display one of these two things. Now, this is kind of, nested ternary operators can be a little bit hard to read. So if you need to change the indentation here to make it a bit more readable, I'm just going to do that here to help you out. You're welcome. So let's indent this stuff here. And that should really be all we need to do. Yeah, that looks pretty good to me. So let's take a look at this now. We're going to go back here and click refresh. And sure enough, we'll see that the loading message flashes there before anything gets displayed. Now, you might want to change that and make it something a little more, something that looks a little better. Like you could do a loading spinner there. You could do some kind of cool animation if you wanted to. But for now, right, just that basic loading ... is perfectly fine for our needs. Cool, so that's our nav bar. Let's continue on converting our components over. The next thing here is going to be our auth route and our unauth route. So let's open those files up. We're going to open up unauth route and auth route. And instead of taking this isAuth prop here, we're going to just take props as the single argument. Okay, and we're going to use our useUser custom hook here in its place. So we'll say import useUser from hooks/useUser. And then down here, we'll say const user equals, there we go, user equals useUser. And then for isAuth, right, we can either create a separate variable for this by saying isAuth equals user, right, and that maybe makes it a little more readable, but you can also just say exclamation point user in the ternary operator like that. And most people will understand what that means, I believe. All right, now that's our auth route. Let's do the same thing for our unauth route. It's going to look almost identical, so we'll just say import useUser from hooks/useUser. We're going to say const user equals useUser. There we go. And then we'll just say, instead of isAuth, exclamation point user. All right. Oh, and let's also remove this isAuth prop, and we'll remove those props. Well, here. We can just change this now to a single argument. And then in our app.js component, let's remove those things from where they are. Oh, we never removed this from our nav bar. We don't need it there anymore. So we'll remove that. For auth route, we can remove isAuth. We can remove unauth route here. We can remove isAuth in our unauth route here as well. All right, so what we're going to see now is if we refresh the page, everything's going to be pretty much the same as it was before, except now our route components are using that custom hook that we created instead of just getting a prop passed down to them. Now, one other thing that you might want to consider doing with the auth route and unauth route, you may have noticed that we didn't use the isLoading property inside these things when we were using this custom hook. Now, the reason we didn't have to do that is inside our app component, remember, we're not actually displaying any of these routes unless everything is done loading. So we have sort of a built-in protection for all of our route components because we know that by the time these things are actually displayed and by the time their logic is executed, right, by the time they execute this hook here, we know that it's not going to be loading anymore. However, if you were going to reuse these auth route and unauth route components in another application where you have a different setup, right, in your routing logic, you would probably want to add that isLoading here just to make sure that you don't end up displaying a redirect just because something's loading, right? Because at first, right, if these things weren't inside of this isLoading thing, if we didn't have this protection, and we can just comment that out if you want to see what'll happen, what we'll see is that we'll get that weird little redirect and we'll end up taking a look at the login page before, before the user actually gets to the home page. Now, obviously, that's not, that's not an ideal situation. It looks kind of funky, and it doesn't really give me a whole lot of trust in the website. Just gives me kind of the heebie-jeebies somehow. So that's why I recommend that you add that isLoading property to the auth route and unauth route, even if you think that those are going to always be protected from loading logic. So What I'm going to do is just go into here. Oops, I made some mistakes there syntax-wise. What I'm going to do is just go into these two routes and add is loading. And inside both of those, we can just say if is loading, return loading, right? Or whatever your loading component is. And I'm going to just do that here as well. I'll copy this, paste it inside unauth route, and that should be all we need to do. Okay, so one last thing just to make sure that's working correctly. It looks like we're all good. All right, and the last component we need to convert now is going to be our home page. So for our home page, instead of taking the user as a prop again, we're going to just get it from the custom hook. So we'll say import use user from hooks/use user, and then we'll say const, and we'll say user equals use user. And that should work. So if we go back here and just refresh, we'll see that everything works as before. Now, this one does have the same potential for difficulties with user as before. Namely, if user doesn't exist, if this homepage does somehow get displayed when user is null, that'll end up throwing an error, right? Because basically we'll be trying to access a property on a null value. So if you want to protect yourself from that, what I would recommend is just adding in user and user metadata, blah, 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 and then user and user ID, right? You could also put those guards at the beginning of this line. For example, you could say something instead like, hang on just a minute here. There we go. You could say something like user and paragraph, blah, 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 blah. We need to add this curly brace back, and you could do the same thing down here as well. So that would just make it so that those elements weren't displayed at all if the user didn't exist. Okay? Oops, so we need to add a closing curly brace there. So now, right, if user was null, if we were to just say const user equals null, which could in theory happen if we were using this home page in some kind of different situation, or if we changed the setup of our app component, we can see that those things just wouldn't be displayed. Whereas before, right, if we were to just go back to what we had earlier, hang on, I'm just going to undo that. If we were to go back to what we had earlier and say const user equals null, this would actually give us an error, okay? So just to protect ourselves from that happening, let's change these back. And oops, I undid too far, so I have to redo this again. There we go, there we go. And that's all we need to do. So everything's working now. And that's all of our components. The last thing we need to do is just remove this last user prop from our homepage in our app component, and we are now done. So we can actually remove this user thing altogether, right? Or just that user variable from our app component, because we're not actually using it or accessing it. We're just waiting to see if this thing is done loading and letting the rest of the components take care of the actual user authentication logic. So I hope this has been informative for you, and I'd like to thank you for viewing.